Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this year's third installment of a public initiative hosted by the US-Asia Institute, Northeast Asia in Focus. For those of you who have attended our other events in the past, welcome back. And for those who are new to the US-Asia Institute, thank you for joining us. My name is Megan Yeo, and I am a program assistant at the US-Asia Institute. For a bit of brief background, USAI is a nonpartisan, United Nations recognized nonprofit with a 43-year track record of building understanding and strengthening ties between the peoples and governments of the United States and Asia. This specific series will provide unique opportunities for the public to engage in issues of importance to the region of Northeast Asia. As Northeast Asia continues to be a region of economic, strategic, and political importance, gaining a deeper understanding of the challenges and opportunities the region faces and areas for further US engagement is paramount. Northeast Asia in Focus targets congressional staff, US executive branch officials, foreign diplomats, and members of the policy and business communities. This briefing will provide an overview of the economic and social impacts of population aging in Northeast Asia on areas such as labor, social security, gender balance, and family dynamics. Now, I'd like to get the briefing started with just a couple of housekeeping notes. First, I'd like to give a special thanks for the support of USAI's corporate stakeholders for helping to make this program possible. The SANS, AIG, ConocoPhillips, FedEx, Walmart, and Fairfield Maxwell. And I'd also like to note that during the last 15 minutes or so of the briefing, there will be time for questions from the audience. If you have a question that you would like our speakers to address, please type it in the Q&A function at any time, or you can directly message me if you prefer. Now, moving on to today's program, I'd like to introduce our moderator for the discussion, Professor Andrew L. Oros. Professor Andrew L. Oros is Professor of Political Science and International Studies at Washington College in Chestertown, Maryland. As a fellow at the Wilson Center in Washington, D.C. in the previous 2 years, he has been examining how demographic change, such as shrinking populations, aging societies, and gender imbalances affects the security environment in the Indo-Pacific region, and, in particular, the network of US alliances and partnerships in the region. You'll be able to read more about Professor Oros in our program found in the chat function. We are very fortunate to have him with us today, so without further ado, I'll pass it over to you, Professor Oros, to introduce today's fellow panelists and continue this public briefing.
Thank you, Megan, for that introduction. And hello, everyone. Welcome to the second session of the US-Asia Institute's Northeast Asia in Focus. To everyone calling in today from DC and from around the country, thank you for joining us. Our panelists are spanning the coasts of the US ourselves. We know that you're all very busy and we appreciate the time you're taking to learn more about this crucial region of Asia throughout this session. As Megan noted, I've been conducting my own research on this topic for the past couple of years from the angle of military security implications. And so I'm particularly interested in hearing some of our panelists' insights related to their own areas of focus. As part of the Northeast Asia in Focus series, today's briefing will focus on the economic and social impact of population aging in China, Japan, and Korea on areas such as labor, social security, gender balance, and family dynamics, as Megan noted. We are honored to have with us today two distinguished experts on the region. First, I'd like to welcome David Dollar. David is a senior fellow at the John L. Thornton China Center at the Brookings Institution and host of Brookings trade podcast, Dollar and Cents. And he's a leading expert on China's economy and US-China economic relations. Welcome, David. And next, I'd like to welcome Professor Gi-wook Shin. Gi-wook Shin is the William J. Perry Professor of Contemporary Korea in Sociology. And he has been serving as the director of the Walter H. Shorenstein Asia Pacific Research Center since 2005, as well as the founding director of the Korea program since 2001. His research concentrates on social movements, nationalism, development, and international relations with a focus on Korea and broader Asia. You can find the full bios of our speakers as well as mine in the program posted in the chat function if you'd like to learn more. Allow me just to set the stage with a few opening statistics about the unprecedented demographic change that we have seen in Northeast Asia in the past decade and what demographers expect in the coming decades. And then I will turn it over to our fellow panelists, starting with David. So the first thing that I would like to note to set the stage is that Japan became the world's first super age society in 2005, which means that over 20% of its population was age 65 or over. What demographers can tell us is that North and South Korea and Taiwan are likely to be next, and China will follow soon after, all before around 2034 is what is predicted. If we look at a snapshot just today, actually not today, but a snapshot of 2020, the latest data that I have, a little over 28% of Japan's population today is 65 and over. In South Korea and Taiwan, it's about 16%. In China, it's about 12%. And in Russia, it's a little over 9%. So we can see that it's a significant number. And I'd also like to note as an opening statistic that this number is growing rapidly. So part of the data that I'm preparing for a book I'm working on looks at the growth from 2010 to 2020. So in the last decade, the 65 plus population in South Korea, in Taiwan, and in China grew by over 50% in that 10-year period. In Japan, it grew by about 24%, which seems less, but that's because Japan started aging earlier. In Russia, it grew by about 20%, and in North Korea by about 12%. The one exception in the Northeast Asian region is Mongolia. In addition to this data on rapid aging in Northeast Asia, I'd like to just make two opening observations that perhaps we might discuss as part of our focus on aging. The first point I'd like to observe is that in addition to this rapid aging, all 6 of these major states in Northeast Asia, so apart from Mongolia, will also experience working age population shrinkage in this coming decade. And total populations will begin to shrink by the 2030s. It already has begun to shrink in Japan. So here's one factoid. By 2050, the combined population loss of Japan, China, and Russia is over 100 million people. The second broader observation I'd like to make is that if we go farther out from Northeast Asia and think about the full Asian region, the picture is much more varied. And that's something that we might discuss in Q&A, but it's not the focus of our discussion today. But there are large, growing, and youthful populations in the broader Indo-Pacific region, including the Philippines, India, Indonesia, Vietnam, Malaysia, and others. So that's something that we might discuss in Q&A. But with that sort of opening statistical introduction, I'm excited to hear from our panelists today to discuss how these change relate to their own research areas. It's sure to be an interesting session, and let me put an early plug in also for future sessions of USAI's Northeast Asian Focus series. You can check out their website or social media as well to follow that. So with that, I'd like to turn over to David for his remarks, and followed by Professor Sheen. And then we'll engage in a brief discussion before taking as many of your questions as we can in the audience. Thank you. David?
Thank you very much, Andrew. It's a great pleasure to join this webinar. I'm going to introduce 4 points in the discussion, focusing particularly on the economics, which is my area of expertise. First, I think, as is well known, the total fertility rate has dropped far below replacement in China, Korea, and Japan. The most recent estimate for China is 1.3. Japan, I believe, is also at about 1.3. And the data I looked at said South Korea is actually below 1 in terms of total fertility rate. And so these are well below replacement. And in thinking about different issues, one issue naturally is to ask, can these countries dramatically raise the total fertility rate? And here, frankly, I'm very skeptical. A number of countries have tried to incentivize young people to have more babies, and generally doesn't work because there are really complex forces going on here. These countries we're talking about are densely populated. They are expensive. It's expensive to find housing. It's expensive to educate. And it's just expensive to raise children. So I'm quite skeptical that much can be done to change that basic demographic picture. I often think of demographics as being basically cooked into the cake. And I think these Northeast Asian societies are going to have to live with this, the implications of these very low fertility rates. Now, the second point I want to introduce is that in general, the main economic effect of this kind of population aging is to slow down the growth of GDP. In general, the savings rate falls as the society ages. You know, Andrew emphasized the growth in the population over 65, which is a common statistic. But I like to point out that in the case of China, the fastest growing cohort will be the group that's older than 85 years old. You know, that group, I've co-authored a book called China 2049 with a good chapter on demographics. And that over 85, the so-called old olds, that group is going to increase. I think it goes from about 50 million to 200 million between now and 2049. And in general, it's quite expensive taking care of that group. And you know, these are people who've made wonderful contributions to society, and they should be taken care of. And it's going to be expensive, whichever approach is taken, staying in the home or moving to assisted living, whatever. All of these are actually going to be relatively expensive, and that's going to take resources away from stimulating the economy. I think the other thing I would point out is that, you know, a lot of entrepreneurship is among a relatively young group of people. And for a variety of reasons, it's hard to maintain the dynamism of an economy once the labor force starts shrinking. You know, I like to think in very intuitive terms. The economy is always being buffeted by shocks, and there's changes in demand, changes in supply. If your labor force is growing, it's easier to adjust. You know, suppose we're going to need a lot more healthcare workers. If your labor force is growing, then you want more of the young people coming along to get educated in the health professions and move into them. If your labor force is shrinking and there's a shock and you need more healthcare workers, you know, you essentially are trying to move workers from one sector of the economy to another. That's a lot more difficult and expensive. So for a variety of reasons, it's pretty clear as you get this societal aging, you tend to get slower growth rates. Now, the third point I want to make is that the government can do at least some temporary things to mitigate this slowdown effect. So, you know, I began by being quite pessimistic. There's much you can do about the total fertility rate, but dealing with the labor force is a slightly different issue. And I would say all of these societies have obvious things they can do that it would at least give them a temporary reprieve. So, for example, in the case of China, China has very high female labor force participation, which is great, but women tend to retire at very young ages there, sometimes as young as 55. You know, and China will have to reform its pension system and probably establish a more realistic retirement age, both for men and women up around 65 or a little bit older. And so that can essentially buy them a little time in terms of the decline of the labor force, but it's temporary. You know, eventually the demographics are going to win out. In Japan and South Korea, you actually have rather low female labor force participation, certainly compared to China. So if you could get, you know, if there were more women with the proper education who want to work and who have the support they need, childcare, if they have one or more children at a young stage of their work life, other types of social services, you can actually, you know, again, mitigate to some extent the decline in the labor force, but it's temporary. You know, just do the math. If you bump up the female labor force participation from, I think it's about in the mid 50s in Japan, South Korea. If you bump it up to the mid 60s, that will have an effect, but then eventually the demographics are going to win out and the labor force is going to decline. Now, the fourth point I wanted to make, Andrew, I did touch on those other countries, so I apologize if you wanted to hold off on that, but I think this is a very important point. The fourth point I wanted to introduce in the conversation is that economic integration can definitely mitigate some of the economic effects. And the most obvious example of that would be immigration. So if the Northeast Asian economies can absorb a lot of immigrants from Southeast Asia and South Asia, where population is younger and still growing, that would definitely mitigate the effects. I'm not too optimistic about immigration because, again, these are densely populated countries, not really that welcoming to foreigners, frankly. So I guess I wouldn't lead with immigration. I would lead with trade and investment. I find it interesting that these three we're talking about, they're a key part of this RCEP agreement, Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, involving 10 nations of Southeast Asia, plus the three we're talking about, plus Australia and New Zealand. That's a very powerful grouping that will have labor force growth in the aggregate. And so deeper integration means there's the potential to combine capital and technology from Northeast Asia with labor from Southeast Asia. That could be done through trade or it could be done through direct foreign investment. Obviously, long history of Japan and South Korea investing in other Asian countries, and now China is becoming a major investor as well. So, I do think that, I don't think it's a coincidence that those Northeast Asian economies are pursuing these new trade agreements. China's applied to join the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which is even more ambitious than the RCEP agreement. So I do think, I think that's a trend. And if you look at the issue Asia-wide, it's definitely a little bit more encouraging than if you just focus on the demographics in China, South Korea, and Japan. Those are my opening remarks, Andrew, and I look forward to hearing from Professor Shin and for the discussion.
Great, thank you, David. Professor Sheen.
Okay, thank you. I'm very happy to be here, and oftentimes, we talked about North Korea nuclear issue to the Washington audience. So it's a nice change from the topic today to talk about demographic challenges, which are arguably one of the most challenging issues for those countries in Northeast Asia. So here I can probably point out what I call triple challenges for those countries. One is aging population. The second, low birth rate. The third one, I'd say, either brain drain or brain train, which I'll explain. Okay, so aging population, already we talked about this issue, and I think there are, question about elderly, health and poverty, and also, social isolation during the pandemic. I just came back from Korea last week, and actually my mother is over 90. My parents-in-law are late 80s. So, I actually, look at them, then, in a sense, it's a little, difficult to watch them because, they are relatively in good health, but still, their quality of life has really declined substantially over the years. And so, I mean, this is, issue facing a lot of, Korean people, parents and their children, today. The second one, low birth rate, already mentioned that, Korea is #1 in the world in terms of fertility. I think right now, something like 0.9 or 0.89. And when I was growing up in Korea in 1970s, government was really trying to control population. Okay, so their slogan was that just two babies, whether son or daughter, and just two baby and raise them well. Okay, now things change a lot, right? Now say, please have more babies. Okay, we'll pay you if you have a baby. We'll pay daycare for your children, right? I think like in Korea, they're spending more than $10 billion every year to boost birth rate, but it hasn't worked out. Actually, they're going reverse. The fertility rates keep dropping, right? So as they mentioned, I'm not optimistic that they are able to increase birth rate in anytime soon. Okay, third one, I think especially for Korea, brain drain also an important issue. You think about population is aging, less babies. Well, a lot of young people want to leave the country. So when I was in college in the 1970s, I think we sort of take it granted that we'll stay in Korea, okay, after graduation and work in Korea. But now if you talk to young Korean people, I think more than half of them, they don't mind, leaving the country and working or migrating to, other countries. And I think Japan's somewhat different issue because young people are becoming, very much inward looking. They don't want to leave the country, but then less interaction with the outside world. And China, with the growing conflict with the United States and Australia, there's some impact on their talent development as well. So, in a sense, among Korea, Japan, China, in different ways, they are affecting the development of human and social capital. So as a result, already, working age population has been declining in Korea, Japan, probably soon in China. So certainly that's putting in a heavy burden on the younger generation. And many colleges in Korea, Japan, they're struggling to fill the classroom. So they have to import actually, students from, foreign countries like China or Southeast Asia just to fill the classroom. And also implication for the military because the number is declining. Okay, so the question is, what to do, right? So I'm gonna focus on one issue, then maybe suggest a couple of ideas. One is certainly, migration. If you look at Japan and Korea, they've been promoting sort of this notion of ethnic homogeneity, right? We are, homogeneous people. They were not receptive to migrants. But now they cannot ignore anymore, right? So, migration was a big part of Abenomics in Japan. And then the new government in Korea now, they are saying that they may establish a new agency of migration. So certainly, migration has become a big topic for discussion in Korea and Japan at least. And certainly in the past few decades, Japan and Korea imported unskilled labor from China and Southeast Asia. But now they have to consider importing skilled labor because they need more talent for the economy. But they are really struggling to attract, skilled labor from the outside. So I think in terms of migration, you can bring students and then give them working visa, which can lead to migration, or you can import labor directly for the workplace. And in my own case, I never imagined to stay in the United States. I came here to study, but then I stay with H-1B visa. Then I became U.S. citizen eventually. So this is like a study work migration path, which is quite popular in Australia, Canada, US, and so on. So if you look at Japan now, over 300,000, foreign students are studying in Japanese colleges. In Korea, the number is over 100,000. And probably China will face a similar situation quite soon. So in a sense, things are getting better and there are more recognition in Japan and Korea, but still not enough. Because in Korea, most of them who came to study, they leave after graduation. And Japan is getting better, I think much better than Korea, but still not many people stay, permanently in Japan, even after working a few years in Japanese companies. So, certainly they need more, migrants, especially with skilled, talent, but they're really struggling to attract, foreign talent. I think, one main issue or challenge is, cultural issue. Still, Japan, Korea, it's not really, friendly place for foreigners. And, they've been promoting, multiculturalism, but largely targeting, foreign bride and unskilled labor. The policy has been, highly assimilationist. So I think, for Japan and Korea, main challenge is how to compete with immigrant countries like Australia, Canada, over foreign talent. So even though they understand or recognize the need to attract foreign talent, and they've been implementing some policies, but their outcome has not been successful. So I think that's why it's more than institutional issue. I think a cultural issue, how to promote cultural diversity is a big challenge for these countries because culture changes very slowly. Okay, now you may have a few ideas. One is like a better use of female labor, as David mentioned already. The other one, some creative ideas or approach. For example, like maybe new understanding of, let's say, cohabitation. Okay, now I think it's becoming more popular in Korea at least, probably in Japan too. But then still, it's not really socially or culturally accepted in their society. So for example, like let's say a couple cohabits, and then if a woman becomes pregnant, they are pressured to marry, right? So therefore, either they don't get pregnant, right, or try to avoid. So like cohabitation is largely a prelude to marriage, not an alternative. But if you talk to young people, they don't necessarily want to marry, but then they may want to live together, right? So, if you compare Japan and Korea to US or European countries, right? So probably much less tolerance of things like cohabitation. So should there be any change? I mean, that's one idea. The other one, what's the impact of AI on the labor force? So, once again, in 1970s, they were trying to control the population. At the time saying, we need more labor, then people say you're crazy, right? So now we worry about declining working age population. And a few years ago, in my class, I think a student from computer science, he was raising question: could this be blessing in disguise? Because in the coming years, maybe AI might replace a lot of labor. And then maybe 20 years later, people may appreciate that, declining, working age population, right? So, one possible project is to have a very elaborate simulation, okay? I mean, there must be a lot of assumptions, right, to consider. But then, let's say 20 years from now, Okay, having less population, is it really good or bad? Okay, I'm raising this issue because once again, in the 1970s, we all tried to contain population. Now we worry about declining population. 20 years later, what will be topic for discussion? So I think that's a good question that we should all think about. So I'll stop here. Thank you.
Great, thank you. For those of you watching the chat and the Q&A, there's just a few public questions posted, but rest assured we have quite a lot of private questions that have been filtered to me. So I want to jump right into addressing as many of those questions as I can. And I'm going to generally take them in baskets of 2 at a time. And again, for our panelists, I'll note I'm going to try to get through at least 8 questions. So let's try to be sort of brief so we can get through as many as possible and maybe refer to some other things people can read on those topics if you're aware of them. The first question I'm going to throw out is just a single question. We've been talking about Northeast Asia as a region. There's a lot of commonality here. They're largely ethnically homogeneous places. There's not a lot of immigration. We've talked about these broader trends, but could we spend a couple of minutes talking about what's different about these places? Is there anything really notable? I'll throw out from my own research a couple of things that I've come across. I did some field work in Korea right at the end of last year. And one of the things I learned is that the elderly 65 and over population in Korea is the poorest demographic group in Korea. And in Japan, the 65 and over population is the richest demographic group. So there's an example of a big difference. What other differences should our audience know about? David or Giwook?
Yeah, I would just add that, China is at a much lower stage of development than either South Korea or Japan. And, that has a lot of implications, but the one I want to throw into the discussion is that, China is still surprisingly rural. They have this complicated system of household registration that's restricted or controlled rural urban migration. There's still been quite a bit of rural urban migration, but the total urbanization rate is about, I think, 62%. So 38% of the population is living in the countryside, and I'm not sure I can prove this, but my instinct is that the elderly are disproportionately represented in the countryside, because you have a lot of rural families where the able-bodied husband and both husband and wife often have gone to the cities to work as migrants, and they leave the grandparents and children behind, partly because they can't bring them to cities and get a full set of services, but also there are these complicated rules about land. So your family can hang on to its land if you leave the grandparents behind, basically, even if they rent it out to someone else to farm. They still have rights over that land, essentially. So, I think that complicates things in China, that you have a lot of these families that have been broken up, and you have a lot of the elderly living in the countryside. And in some ways, the cost of living is lower, but in overall, the quality of life is quite a bit lower in the countryside. I think that's an additional issue for China.
Great, thank you. How about you, Giwook? Do you want to come in on this question?
Well, I think I'd like to come back to my point earlier, because, we are concerned about demographic challenges because it impacts on labor market and the economy, right? And once again, Korea, brain drain is a big issue. Okay, young people may want to leave the country. In Japan, the opposite, once again, they don't want to leave the country, right? Or study. And I think China, this in a geopolitical conflict with the US and Australia and other countries. So I think we have to consider these factors in discussing demographic impact, because they are not isolated; they are all combined. And then in the regard, 3 countries are very different.
Great. We're going to get to the geopolitical conflict part in a moment, but first I want to take a couple of questions that are linked in my mind, at least, about technology. So one one question that's actually in the public question side you may have seen is, what role can robots, especially the questioner is asking about humanoid robots, play in managing these aging populations? I'll note that Giwok discussed artificial intelligence, for example, but I wonder if you have a view about the robots. And a related question in my mind that's come in gets back to a point that David raised in his opening remarks about the old. And the questioner notes that, with advances in pharmaceuticals and other medical technologies, probably we're going to see even more and more of the old, not just 85 and over, but 100 and over. And so what are some of the implications of that, the questioner noted? I'll note, just as a sort of anecdotal tongue-in-cheek, I read recently that Japan stopped giving those turning 100 sterling silver cups in celebration. They've switched them to silver plated because it was just too expensive. But at a more substantive level, what will be some of the implications of that? So robots, the old, maybe those intersect.
Yeah. On robots, I would add that I do think the Chinese leadership and a lot of intellectuals in China are counting on robots and AI in some ways to displace, the workers who are going to be retiring, and that's a reasonable hope to some extent. But what I worry about is that experience seems to suggest that the robots or AI, they will eliminate very large numbers of some specific occupations, right, but not others. Okay, so they're obviously eliminating manufacturing jobs at a very rapid rate. On the other hand, while the AI is useful in healthcare, it doesn't seem to decrease the number of workers in the healthcare system. So I do worry that you might get large job losses through robots in certain sectors, and basically no job loss through automation in other sectors, and then that creates a very complex matching problem. So I don't think robots and AI are an easy solution to this, but they definitely are part of the landscape.
Yeah, I think once again this is an interesting question, because especially like in Japan, robots are being used, right, to care elderly, right? So certainly robots or AI can be used to sort of take care of the elderly in some way. But then the larger issue that I talked about, then also David just mentioned, what's the larger impact of AI on labor force? Okay, so I think there are two views. One is it will replace a lot of jobs. So that was again, having less population may not necessarily bad. On the other hand, people saying that it may replace some jobs, but not all of them. So that still we need human capital. And I think Korea, when I was last couple of weeks, and I think that now one thing speaking popular is like about well dying. So people talk about well dying. Okay, so because now people live long, and then their quality of life has declined, and that's why people now begin to talk about how we can die in a good way. So certainly I see some cultural change in Korean society when I was there in the last couple of weeks.
Great, thank you. I'll also add on this front, on the military security side, that's more my focus. Certainly AI and robotics, and in terms not necessarily humanoid robots as the questioner asked, but like drones, other unmanned systems are certainly going to play a much bigger role in a military security environment in Northeast Asia. That's not only because of demographics, it's also just the nature of technological change. But what I'll note in the area of military security is that that introduces its own new security problems. So, the unmanned systems helps replace, the manned pilots, but then having unmanned systems creates new security problems. Or, cyber helps address some security issues, but then, as we all know, anyone listening to this session today will know of all the challenges in the cyber world that came out of that. So there's a kind of a mixed blessing. But I'd also note it's a little further from my core interest, but in what I'm reading about demographic change and my experience in Japan is I think that Japan on the economic side is going to benefit some from being the first society to go through this transition, and they'll be able to capitalize on some of their experience in marketable ways. So for example, I've seen in Japanese hospitals, prescription drug dispensing robots. They're sort of like humanoid robots. They look more like R2-D2 if you're a Star Wars fan, but they can go from bed to bed. They can confirm the patient through retinal scans. They can take blood pressure and pulse. And what I've heard is that they're actually more reliable than human nurses that were doing that. And then it frees up human labor. And another more kind of gadgety thing, but I think is actually, I'm told is quite serious, is there's artificial pets like Paro, the comfort seal. It's like a little seal that sits on your lap and you can pet it like you could a cat, but you don't have to feed it and you don't have to clean up after it. And it can also, test vital signs. So there are, I think, there are advances that don't seem as threatening as in the military area.
So,
I do want to go to a
can I add one more?
Oh yeah, please do.
Yeah, so I think regarding AI, my view is that it will replace a lot of unskilled labor, okay? But still, I don't think it can replace skilled area. So I think still that's why, for me, what matters the most is not really the number, but how you can, retain or attract talent. Okay, because I think that's a core for your economy, especially for advanced countries like Japan and Korea. So, in a sense, we are talking about just the numbers. Oftentimes, when we talk about demographic challenges, we talk about the numbers. And sure, yeah, the numbers may be important, but for me, what really matters is not so much the numbers, but then the quality of labor. Because some of them can be replaced by robots or AI, but still, we still have to train. We have to still retain our talent. We have to attract the talent from outside. So I think, in a sense, we have to look at that dimension, not just numbers of demographic challenges. Yeah.
Great, thank you. The next basket I'd like to go to, both of you touched on some in your opening remarks that maybe you could augment based on questions I'm getting, is more about how can we address the demographic problem? You both seem pretty skeptical about that in my listening. Professor Sheen, Giwok, you talked about all the large sums that the South Korean government is spending to try to incentivize more children. That doesn't seem to be working so much. David, you sort of alluded to that more, but I didn't want to just let that question drop. Is there anything that you think that the governments should be doing to address the birth rate question? And then a second question that I think is related is about safety nets for the elderly, as we're predicting a larger number of elderly. Is there government policy that these states should be planning for? We've already heard that there's a fair amount of variation between South Korea and Japan and China in this area, but maybe we could delve into that just a little bit more. And then I want to wrap up on the geopolitical stuff in the next basket of questions.
Right, so perhaps Professor Shin would like to go first on this round?
Well, okay, go ahead, yeah.
Well, okay, on the on the kind of what government can do, Andrew, I guess I feel pretty passionate about the immigration issue. As I look at it, if you look at the world, we still have a healthy amount of population growth in the world. And in particular, there's going to be explosive population growth in Africa. So I don't have a lot of sympathy, for the question of, what are essentially, rich countries can maintain their natural birth rates when there's plenty of people in the world. So I think, bringing development to Africa, South Asia, Southeast Asia is important, and immigration back in the other direction will be one important aspect as well. But I'm one of the last believers in globalization. Okay, so I do think, I think our best hope is to treat this as an integrated global issue, rather than focus on what each specific country can do.
Yeah. I second, your point that I think, they should take migration very seriously. Okay, especially, I think they can bring, young talent from developing country, then educate and retain them for labor force. Okay, I mean, if you look at the United States or Australia, it's not that Americans or Australians don't live longer, but but because of immigration, our whole population remains fairly young compared to Japan or Korea. So they can spend more money. Okay, once again, they spend a lot of money to boost birth rate, which is not working. So I think they should spend their resource in taking young people from other countries and educate and train and keep them for their labor force, right? And in order to do so, not only spending more resource, but I think culturally they have to promote value of diversity, because I still find that Korea, Japan is still very unfriendly to foreigners. Okay, like in Japan during pandemic, they be blocked, right? Foreigners, coming from the outside. So unless they can promote cultural diversity, it will be very difficult to attract talent from the outside. Once again, it's a reality that their own labor is not enough, okay, to meet the demands of the economy. They have to attract talent from foreign country. They have to compete, with other countries like Australia, Canada, US, and so on. So I think they should take migration, very seriously. It should be more than rhetoric. They have to promote environment in which foreigners can come and work and live together. So I think I don't see any other good solution than that, but then they're still very slow to change.
Great, thank you. Both of your comments, I think, help transition us to the next kind of basket of questions that I'm going to just pose very broadly, because there's a number of different interrelated ones, but has to do more with the geopolitical implications. So if we move beyond just looking at Northeast Asia, what are the broader global implications of this rapid aging in this one region of the world that happens to include the second and third largest economies in the world, and soon with China likely the number one sized economy in the world. I'm going to take the liberty as moderator to offer my thoughts briefly on the military security side, but perhaps David would like to augment more about the regional integration or the global area. Ewok, you probably have some thoughts about this as well. I know you write about a wide variety of things, but what I would say briefly is I think that seeing this rapid aging and ultimately population shrinkage in Northeast Asia has pushed countries like the United States and Japan to consider more security partners regionally. And I think it's contributed to the reconceptualization of what we used to call the East Asia to be the Indo-Pacific. Right, India will be the largest population country in the world by the end of this decade, pushing beyond China. Places like Indonesia also growing, large country growing, US ally, the Philippines. So I think that we're increasingly thinking about in the US about how to find more partners to help with security. And Japan is doing the same thing. Japan will have a new national security strategy out near the end of this year. And I think we can expect that it's going to double down on its last strategy of finding more partners. So I think that's one area. And a second area, I don't want to be alarmist, but one of the key messages of my forthcoming book on this is I see the latter half of the 2020s as a very unstable time. As I think what we're seeing is contrary to what demographers and people writing about the linkage with national security were writing about a decade ago, we're not seeing a move towards more peaceful interactions in aging societies. Actually, we're seeing Japan, South Korea, China, all increasing defense spending right now. And my explanation for that is that they're trying to lock in gains that they know aren't going to continue in the longer term. We had a different question that we might get to in a bit about Japan's huge budget deficit. But in my view, I do think that Japan is going to increase defense spending over the next several years substantially. But I also don't think that's going to be sustainable in the 2030s with Japan's level of debt. But I think it's creating a bit of an arms race right now. So those are two of my thoughts. Why don't we start with you this time, as you said, David, to mix things up a little. Geopolitical implications beyond just the region?
Well, I guess I can make 2 points. I'm not sure I'm really answering your question, but one is rise of this anti-immigrant sentiment and nationalism in many parts of the world, right? And that certainly impacts labor mobility or across the region. So as I mentioned earlier, you have to import talent from the outside. But growing tension geopolitically, that really hurt talent mobility, and certainly the pandemic also constrained talent mobility a lot. The other one, we talk about cooperation and trade, and probably in the Pacific area, I think we should talk about maybe cooperation in labor or talent mobility. So that's maybe one area that we haven't really talked about, but there's something worth talking about in the coming years. So I'll just make those 2 points.
Yeah, Andrew, I would add, I think it makes sense for the United States to be kind of looking for a wider range of security partners in the Indo-Pacific. But I worry that the US is kind of falling behind in terms of economic integration. I think it was a mistake for the US to pull out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and the US is not, interested in any new trade agreements, investment agreements in the Indo-Pacific. And I think a lot of our partners there are essentially, looking for both economic integration and security guarantees. And the US is coming through quite strongly with the security guarantees. And I think that plays an important role in the region. But what I hear from lots of different players around the region is noticing that the US is increasingly absent on the economic side. So I do worry a little bit about whether that's sustainable for the US to be, strengthening its security alliances, which I support. But at the same time, the US seems to be pulling back economically from East Asia. And I think that's a mistake.
And one kind of very specific question you may want to address, David, is about Japan's ballooning government debt. I know you focus more on China, but is that something that we should be concerned about?
Yeah, so this is definitely not my area of expertise. From what I read, because it's self-financed essentially with a very large savings rate in Japan, it doesn't create the same kind of risks as countries that are running deficits and essentially borrowing from abroad. Japan is definitely not doing that. I guess just as a citizen, I would be worried if my government were running up as much debt, and the US is frankly not too far behind. So I do worry. I don't think the US should do anything draconian, but I really wish we would get on a sustainable fiscal path. I mean, the basics of it, I worked in the World Bank for 20 years. It's all just really common sense. During the good times, you should run budget surpluses and build up, reserves in a sense. And then during downturns and crises, et cetera, you can be a net borrower, and over time, it's all sustainable. And we've only learned half of that lesson in the United States. So we're, when there's a shock, as there's been with COVID, we're really good about borrowing trillions of dollars. But when things are going well, we don't do the other side of that advice. We don't run fiscal surpluses and build up resources. So I do worry about our long-term fiscal sustainability.
Gi-wook, I wonder on this point, one thing that I heard when I was in Korea at the end of last year is some degree of optimism about the elderly population, that the current 65 and over population were the people who really contributed to Korea becoming one of the top 10 economies in the world, and they made very low wages, and so their retirement savings are very limited. But as we move into the next generation of retirement, those people will have much more substantial retirement assets than the last generation. So there's a change taking place in Korea that's different than what we see in Japan and in China. I think that ultimately will happen, but it's much further off. So maybe a last question I'll take the liberty of posing to you both on this related topic is, David, you noted earlier that because China is more of a developing country than South Korea and Japan, again, there perhaps is an optimistic side of that they haven't made the commitments to the retirement pensions and the high levels of healthcare that are ballooning in costs in South Korea and in Japan right now. So maybe they'll be able to get off on the cheap, I wonder. And Gi-wook, I wonder if you also see some optimism. I'm in sunny California right now, so I want to try to end a bit optimistically. It's not all doom and gloom. It's actually pretty great that people are living long, healthy lives, right? And that there's very low infant mortality. So this, isn't all bad. But do we see some bright spots?
I mean, China is, certainly special among countries, and it's possible South Korea and Japan have the same characteristic, but in China, there really is a filial responsibility under the law. People are supposed to take care of their parents. And I think some of the economic technocrats in China, I think perhaps mistakenly think that the state, will avoid having to pick up a lot of the tab for taking care of the elderly, because it's going to be the responsibility of children, essentially. And I think there's some problems with that. And certainly one aspect of this long period of one-child policy is, you've got a lot of elderly who have one child, that's what the policy was aimed at. And if tragically that one child dies in middle age, or, is not really earning a decent income, for example, you're going to have a lot of destitute old people. So I think the Communist Party is naive to think that, they're not going to have a big price tag hung on them in order to deal with this, and that's the most likely outcome.
Gi-wook, any signs of optimism?
So I say one pessimistic view and the other one more optimistic. The pessimistic view is, you are right that my generation in Korea, they rely on pension system compared to my parents' generation, who relied on personal saving. Okay, so they didn't think that they would live like 80s, 90s, right? So they're saving maybe up to 70. So that's why they're struggling to survive. But then for my generation, a lot of people have pension, but then the pension system is under strain too. So can it really function over the long run? That's one big question for Korea. For optimism, once again, I wanted to, refocus our discussion from the number into like quality of labor. Okay, so certainly, Japan was struggling because, as you mentioned, it was the first advanced nation who was facing demographic challenges. But now we have seen things in Japan and Korea. And I'm a little more optimistic that with all technological development, we may not need as many people as we had in the past, right? So that probably, as I mentioned earlier, maybe having less population 20 years later might be a blessing, not curse. And only time can tell. But then I like to remain more optimistic that with more new technology, we may be able to sustain our economy with less people. So that's sort of my bit of optimism for the future, but we'll see whether this will be true or not.
Well, thank you for indulging my my want for a bit of optimism at the end. I want to thank you both for sharing your expertise and insights for us. I know I learned a lot. Captive audience here. I'm really interested in this topic. And I want to thank everyone in this virtual world out there who logged in and called in today. We know you're busy and taking the time to join us makes us gratified at our mission. I'm going to turn back now to Megan for final announcements from the US Asia Institute. Thank you.
Professor Oros, I greatly appreciate you stepping in to moderate today. Giving both your perspective and leading our discussion today was both impressive and fascinating to listen to. I'd also like to give a huge thank you to Dr. Dollar and Professor Shin for joining us and providing their excellent insight. We were honored to host you, and we appreciate the time you have taken out of your busy schedules to deliver your valuable perspectives. And though we are out of time, we present the opportunity for those tuning in with interest in US-Asia relations to reach out to the US-Asia Institute if they have questions relevant to our future events for this public webinar series. If anyone in the audience would like to follow up with any of our speakers, please reach out to us at usai@usasiainstitute.org, and we will be happy to assist in fostering further dialogue on the issues we discussed today. For congressional staff in our audience tuning in today interested in other Northeast Asia related matters, USAI is currently holding its China 101 Congressional Briefing Series. This series provides unique insight into the US-China relationship, featuring speakers with first-hand knowledge of China. China 101's one-hour sessions offer congressional staff the opportunity to hear from academic, government, and business leaders with direct experience and expertise on US policy towards China and Chinese domestic actions. Thank you again, and I hope everyone has a great rest of the day.